Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 2, Orientalist, Discourse and Colonial Modernity. And our topic is Nationalism and Colonial Modernity. While we have delineated the main currents of thought that went into the renewed interrogations of colonial history, our main concern in the rest of the unit will be mainly with the work of subaltern historians and scholars like Kaviraj and Nandi. It is not within the scope of this unit to make an assessment of the entire body of work produced under the rubric of Subaltern Studies. What we are concerned with here mainly is the later body of works, what Sumit Sarkar has called the late Subaltern Studies, for it is there that the concern with the Orientalism and colonial discourse acquires its most articulate expression. It is there that the most sustained and thorough-going examination of both colonial discourse and the peculiar features of what Parth Chatterjee has called our modernity has been carried out. Much of the later work of Bernard Cohen himself and his students like Nicholas Dirks and Gyan Prakash too can be said to fall broadly within the same body of work. In the discussion that follows, we will discuss certain themes that emerge from this body of work rather than proceed in a strictly chronicle order. We have mentioned that the early work of the Subaltern Studies scholars was concerned with the search for subaltern autonomy, that is, of trying to understand forms of subaltern consciousness and their divergences from those of nationalist political elites, even when they participate in movements led by the leader. This concern naturally led to exploration of how elite consciousness too was formed in the context of colonial subjugation. It led to an exploration of nationalist discourse, its structure and assumptions, as well as to explorations of forms of subaltern consciousness. Two things started becoming apparent in the course of these explorations. First, that nationalism was not simply one monolithic ideological formation that every modern society must have. The situation was complicated by the fact that societies like India's were inserted into modernity by the agency of colonialism. The desire to be modern here was, therefore, enmeshed with the desire to be free and self-governing, that is, be Indian. Early nationalist elite were forced to articulate their politics in a condition of subjugation where they simultaneously aspired to the principles of universal equality and liberty embodied by modern thoughts, and had to mark their difference from the West. Second, as a consequence, it was also becoming apparent that nationalism therefore also involved a formidable and creative intellectual intervention, formulating and defending its main postulates in the battlefield of politics, as Partha Chatterjee put it. With the publication in early 1983 of Benedict Anderson's now classic Amazing Communities, the possibilities had opened out for a more sustained investigation of how nations are invented. With the publication of this immensely insightful book, the idea that there is anything natural or eternal about nation was laid at rest. All nations, Anderson argued, are amazing communities. We should clarify one common misconception here. When Anderson suggests that nations are amazing communities, he does not suggest that nations are therefore unreal or fictitious. On the contrary, he claims they are real and call forth such passion that people are ready to die and kill for it, precisely because they are brought into existence as a consequence of collective imagination. Now, the next topic is nationalism as difference. Let us now turn to some of the features of nationalism and colonial modernity as we know it today from the work of scholars mentioned above. Attaining the nationhood and self-governance the nationalists understood was the only way to be modern. That was the way the world they discovered actually was. The great intellectual question that the 19th century intelligentsia had posed to itself was, why did India become a subject nation? How did a small island nation called Britain attain mastery over this huge landmass? Their answer, we now know, was that this was because India, on the eve of colonial subjugation, was internally divided. That there were hundreds of different principalities and quarrels, deep internal division like those of caste, and it was these that made it impossible for the country to resist colonization. In the modern world, these could not continue. If we have to become free, we had to overcome the deep internal divisions and usher in a form of self-government that will recognize all its people as free citizens. The only way this could be achieved was through the attainment of nationhood, for that was the way modern societies existed. Yet it was something that troubled the emergent nationalist elite. How could they be modern and yet not simply ape the ways of the Western colonial masters? Being modern and striving for nationhood, that is, for liberation from colonial rule, required the subjugated nation, therefore, to mark its difference from the rulers. It had to be a modernity that was different in crucial ways from the baggage of Western modernity as they saw it. The search for a different Indian modernity was then what animated the discourse of nationalism in India. In his essay on the census and the objectification, for instance, Bernard Cohen cited from a 1943 text by Jawaharlal Nehru where Nehru observed, "I have become a queer mixture of the East and West, out of place everywhere, at home nowhere. They are both, that is the East and the West, part of me, and though they help me in both the East and the West, but they are also they create a feeling of spiritual loneliness. I am a stranger and an alien in the West, but in my own country also sometimes I have an exile's feeling." The above quotation by the Nehru highlights one of the most abiding inner conflict of Indian, but more generally of all post-colonial nationalism. If we remember that Nehru was by far the most radical of modernists among all the nationalists, we can imagine what would have been the situation of other nationalist leaders. In fact, this is an anxiety that is evident among the intellectual elite of Indian society long before the formal appearance of nationalism towards the end of the 19th century. Ashish Nandi, for instance, showed in an early essay that there was a resurgence of the phenomena of Sakti in Bengal towards the end of the 18th century. Through an examination of the statistical evidence, he argues that it was only in this period that the right suddenly came to acquire the popularity of the legitimate orgy. Before that, it had declined substantially in most parts of the country. Nandi suggested that it was in the groups made psychologically marginal by their exposure to West impact that the right became popular. These groups therefore felt the pressure to demonstrate to others as well as to themselves their allegiance to traditional high culture. The Bengali elite, being the closest to Western contact, was thus most affected by this anxiety to be different. The question of modernity was, of course, not yet on the agenda at this time. More to the point in that respect is Bipesh Chakravarti's reading of early nationalist tracts in Bengal that concerned domesticity and the position of women. While most writers of the later half of the 19th century were clear that women of this country were uncivilized, lazy, quarrelsome, and therefore bad for domestic happiness due to lack of education, they were also convinced that education itself could produce undesirable traits in women. For education could also make them arrogant, lazy, immodest, and defiant of authority. This was clearly a fear about modern education and exposure to Western ideas that was being expressed by the early elites. The next point is anxieties about the nation's women. The concern with women is evident in both Nandi's exploration of sati and Chakrabarti's exploration of domesticity. It is the woman's question, therefore, argues Partha Chatterjee, that becomes the site for a major nationalist intervention. Chatterjee explores what he calls the nationalist resolution of the woman's question to suggest that the way in which nationalism sought to mark out its difference was by demarcating a sphere of inner sovereignty. What is the nationalist resolution of the women's question? Chatterjee notices that in the last years of the 19th century, with the appearance of nationalism, all the important questions of social reform centered on the status of women, like wit to remarriage, education of women against child marriage, etc., disappear from the public discourse. This happens, he contends, because nationalism starts its journey by demarcating an inner and an outer sphere and declaring itself sovereign in the inner cultural sphere. In the outer sphere, its subjugation is given fact, but in the inner domain of culture, it claims complete sovereignty. It refuses to make the question of women a matter of negotiation with the colonial state. On the other hand, it does not simply rest content with the old status of women. It rather embarks on a project of creating a new woman, educated, active in public life, and at the same time fully aware of her domestic womanly duties. This inner domain, thus suggests Chatterjee, becomes the sphere where nationalism begins to mark its difference from colonial Western modernity. But by vulgarizing cultural difference, nationalism was not always being modern. In fact, as many other studies show, the assertion of cultural difference often became a way of relegating questions of internal inequalities between groups to the sphere of unspeakable. The problem then Chatterjee suggests is that there appears to be a contradiction lodged at the heart of the nationalist project. Its search for modernity was marked by a struggle against modernity in some sense. What was national was not always secular and modern, and the popular and democratic quite often traditional and sometimes frantically anti-modern. Next point is cultural splits and liberal ideas. Sudeepa Kaviraj introduces three more interesting aspects in his delineation of the features of colonial modernity. First, he argues modern colonial education introduced a split in Indian cultural life by bringing into being two rather exclusive spheres of English and vernacular discourse. The concerns that animated these different spheres were very different. While the English speaking world was more concerned with the ideas of individual liberty. Those working in the vernacular world were far less concerned with democracy as a form of government. The vernacular nationalist intelligentsia was more concerned with the problem of collective freedom of the Indian people from British rule rather than with that of individual freedom. Indian nationalist elite encountered the great liberal ideas of equality, freedom, and autonomy in a context of subjugation and were therefore more immediately concerned with issues of national sovereignty. They therefore choose to transfer these ideas into their own concerns. Here we see the second feature. Liberal ideas. Kavira's contents did have a deep and profound influence in Indian political argument, but this influence was not in terms of implanting liberal ideas but nationalist one. This is not a minor or trivial difference, but in a sense crucial, for as Kaviraj points out, the idea of equality between nations or societies can be completely blind to the idea of internal equality within the national community. Hence, even somebody like Gandhi could easily justify the caste system while the claiming national equality and freedom from the British. Now the next point is a different sequence and different modernity. This second feature, according to Kaviraj, is also linked to a third. Modernity in India followed a very different sequence from that in the West. Modernity is a historical constellation. Kaviraj argues that comprises three distinct processes: capitalist industrial production, political institutions of liberal democracy, and the emergence of a society where old community bonds have been largely dissolved and the process of individualization has taken place. This means that in place of old forms of belonging, there have emerged new interest based associations. This is what is called in political theory the space of civil society. In the historical trajectory of the West, democracy emerged after the two processes have developed to a high degree. Initial disciplining of the working class, for instance, took place in the context where there was no possibility of democratic resistance. In fact, democratic aspirations were at least partly a consequence of the process of capitalist industrialization. In India, on the other hand, democracy and parliamentary institutions preceded the other two processes. Kaviraj links this different sequence to a kind of populist politics that comes to dominate the political scene in India and many post-colonial countries. It is this problem that Partha Chatterjee has recently conceptualized in his idea of political society. Chatterjee argues that what is called civil society in the West is a domain of the individuated, rights bearing citizen that is governed by rules of free entry and exit and individual autonomy. Non Western societies, he suggests, are marked by a permanent hiatus between this domain of civil society which is governed by the normative ideas of Western modernity and the vast areas of society that relate to the developmental state as populations that are subject to the policy interventions by the state. Here, it is the responsibility of the government rather than any motion of rights that becomes the ground on which claims of these populations are negotiated. We cannot go into a long discussion of this concept as elaborated by Chatterjee, but it is important to note that according to him, one of the crucial defining features of political society is that it is the domain where the idea of a community still holds a powerful sway, as opposed to the individual who is the defining characteristic of civil society. It is the argument of scholars like Chatterjee and Kaviraj that this peculiar feature of non Western modernity should not be understood as a lack or underdevelopment or as an incomplete modernity. Rather, they should be seen as the specific way in which modernity in the colonial context came to be constituted. It has a different history from that of Western modernity and is likely to have a different feature. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.